Hi, my name is Chloe Caldwell. Today for my AFAS 160 author discussion, I'm going to be discussing Booker T. Washington. In this presentation, I will be talking about who Booker T. Washington was and giving you some background information. I'll be talking about the Tuskegee Institute and the different organizations that he was a part of, as well as his autobiography. Within these different pieces of information, I will be adding pieces from the readings that we have been assigned. Booker T. Washington was born on April 5, 1856 in Halesford, Virginia. He was born into a slave family where he worked long and hard hours on a plantation farm. His mother was named Jane and his stepfather was named Washington. He was unfortunate enough and he never got to meet his biological father. Eventually, him and his family were freed just like all other slaves. After this, his mom and him moved to Walden, Virginia. There he worked in the coal mine and salt furnace up until he was 10 years old. His mom had always seen that he was very interested in school, and education was a huge part of him growing up. Soon he enrolled into the Hampton Institute. This is where he graduated with honors and soon was offered a job as part of the faculty. As soon as he started the Tuskegee Institute, this was a huge part of his legacy he left behind. It was a very popular school that focused on social and political worldviews. He was a part of the Atlanta Compromise as well as the National Negro Business League. Throughout his life, he was married 3 times and had 3 gorgeous children. Sadly, on November 14, 1915, he passed away. He became quite the famous speaker as well as a writer. Booker T. Washington wrote 2 books. One was The Story of My Life and Work, and the other one was his autobiography. In 1900 was when he wrote his autobiography called Up From Slavery. First, the book was published into a magazine called Outlook. This was a very popular magazine for families. Soon his book was translated into French, German, Spanish, Russian, and a half a dozen more languages. This was very rare, especially nowadays. It's hard for many people to get their books translated into that many languages. But I thought this was very powerful coming from a Black man during these times. It showed that you can come from something horrible and build yourself up to be someone. He was just a little old slave boy working on a plantation farm and now has a huge platform in the public eye. He designed this autobiography to appeal to the class of the people who have money, and this is exactly what he did. The book Up From Slavery was extremely popular among the white population, which was very surprising. This book focused on the self-help within the African American community, since the whites refused to take any responsibility for their actions for over the past few decades. This was the first of many autobiographies that were relating to the slavery issues. He created a movement. By him stepping up and sharing his own personal story, this allowed others to feel just as comfortable to share their own. However, this book did cause many mixed emotions. Many people praised him for it, but other people had issues with it. Many didn't agree with his belief on not focusing on the whites' responsibilities for the harm that they've caused previously, but instead he focused on the self-help aspect. This was a theme throughout all of his readings. The Tuskegee Institute was a huge part of his life. This was one of his prized possessions. He spent his entire life working on the school, making it everything it could be. The school was a Black-ran educational institution that promoted his philosophical idea of African American education and socioeconomic progress. These philosophies included industrial education, accommodation of Southern white supremacists, and the emphasis on racial pride, solidarity, and self-help. The school opened on July 4th, 1881. At first, they were just renting the local church area where they would hold their classes. Later, they purchased the old plantation farm he used to work on. Booker T. Washington soon became the headmaster of the university and was all he ever worked on. This provided African Americans that they were worthy of full economic and political rights, that if they would work hard and obtain financial independence and cultural advancements, he believed that society would eventually accept the equality. When he passed away, the Tuskegee Institute had over 100 buildings, over 15,000 students, and around 200 faculty. And this university is around in present day. The Atlanta Compromise took place on September 18, 1895 at the Atlanta Exposition Speech. This was considered one of the most controversial speeches during the deep racial prejudice times. This is where Booker T. Washington spoke for all of the African Americans living in the South. This compromise stated that African American people shouldn't plead for social political equality, like having the right to vote, and the racial remarks dealing with discrimination and segregation. However, in doing this, they would receive free basic education. Basic education consisted of industrial, nursing, and teaching training. This was the very first speech given by an African American man that was presented in front of a mixed audience. Both blacks and whites were in the audience. In his speech, he basically urged African Americans to accept social segregation. He believed that they should be separated but equal. This is where many African American people had issues with his speech. Many believed that he was belittling the pain that the whites have caused them. As I mentioned before, the Atlanta Compromise speech was a very controversial act. I pulled a few quotes that I thought stood out to me the most. The first one was how he opened the speech. 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. Not only did he use this reference of 1/3 in his speech during the Atlanta Compromise, he also used it many times in his autobiography. This quote reads, "We shall constitute 1/3 and more of our ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 of its intelligence and progress. We shall contribute to 1/3 of the business and industrial prosperity." This is found on page 745. I believe the idea behind constantly reinforcing the 1/3 is that African American people are a huge part of the South's population. They are still people, and their ideas and rights should be heard and respected. Another phrase that stuck out to me was, "It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top." I really like this quote because it's something my dad says to me often. But I think in this scenario, it was Booker T. Washington was just trying to give the African American people hope. They have been in really hard and dark, nasty times that no one wishes to be upon. But trying to get them to have more rights and treated equally, it's a process. And by saying there's a beginning and an end, to get to the end, you have to put in a lot of work and be patient in order to see what they truly want. So Booker T. Washington has been working hard on getting them their rights. The last quote that really stuck out to me was, "Cast down your buckets where you are." This phrase was said around 4 times in his speech. He gave an analogy dealing with the fresh water. However, I think Washington was trying to say that no race can prosper and grow till they can learn to put their differences aside and build new relationships with another. Another way to look at this quote is to stop where you are, make the best of what you have, and try to make it work. This compromise would be the first step between the races, hoping to begin new relationships and only working towards the equality. Some of the other quotes that stuck out to me in our readings was on page 548. It states, "Best way to ensure progress and peace in the South was for Euro-Americans to respect African Americans' desire for improved economic opportunity, and for African Americans to accept that Euro-Americans' desire for social separation of races." I believe this reinforces Booker T. Washington's ideas he had mentioned before about separate being equal, meaning that they have the same rights as a white man would. However, in order to do this, the African American race needs to be responsive and earn it, as mentioned later throughout the text. It says that they need to be valuable, productive members of society who deserves fair treatment. On page 575, it states, Burrough offered me $50,000 and $200 a night in expenses. This quote was dealing with after his speech had been so public that he was getting lots of attention from magazines and newspapers and stuff. Later he exclaims in the text that whatever he does, whatever he creates, he's doing it for his life work, which his life work was the Tuskegee Institute. He only did things in order to benefit the school and his race. I think this just shows how humble and dedicated this man is. He was offered a ton of money at different occasions to make appearances for his speeches, but he only wanted to do the work that would help his race and better his life's work. Overall, you can see that Booker T. Washington was a very successful man. He increased socioeconomic success for African American people. He created an education empire, and he decreased the hate between both the whites and the blacks. Here is a list of my references, and this is all that I have for my presentation of Booker T. Washington. Thank you for listening.